Scrap quilts became commonplace during the Great Depression when quilters had to use every bit of fabric they had. Scrap quilts are one of my favorite types of quilts. Do you have a favorite pattern for your scrap quilts? If you do, please be sure to tell me about that in the comments below. Today I'm going to talk to you about 4 scrap quilt patterns that I really like and one pattern that I hope to use in 2024. The first pattern that I want to share with you that always has made great scrap quilts is the log cabin quilt. And I have an example of that here behind me. Now, I've made several log cabin quilts over the years, and I have to say this pattern is my favorite. These blocks are made up of just a simple traditional log cabin block, and you can put this together in all kinds of different patterns. When I decided on this one, I tried out a bunch. I put them all up on my design wall and tried lots of different types of blocks. I looked at the courthouse step block. I looked at just a traditional log cabin, and then I ran across this one and I really liked it. Now, I did use the log cabin trim tool 2 ruler. This ruler is fantastic. It has you can make 6-inch blocks or 12-inch blocks. You can make a log cabin block, the courthouse step block, or you can make a half log cabin block. So you can make a lot of different quilts with just this one ruler in a couple of different sizes. Now for this quilt I used my scrap bins and I did pull a little bit from my stash. But you just can't go wrong with the log cabin quilt block when you're making scrap quilts. Now, in the description below, I'll put a link for the log cabin trim tool 2 ruler, as well as a link for the video on how to use the ruler. The next block I wanted to share with you is the Bearpaw Quilt. It is a wonderful block. Again, you can put it in all kinds of different combinations, but I made this quilt for a challenge at our local quilt guild, and I really like the way this one turned out. I think the Bearpaw may be my all-time favorite block. I like star blocks, but I love the Bearpaw quilt block. I also like blocks that have half square triangles, and I used half square triangle sheets to make this quilt, and it went together super fast. This is the only big quilt that I've made using the Bearpaw quilt, but I've made lots of different smaller projects. I've made pillows and small quilts for the walls and table runners using the Bearpaw quilt. So don't think you're limited to the Bearpaw with just a big one. You can definitely use it for a smaller quilt, and it looked great in fall colors. So now in the comments below, tell me if you've ever made a Bearpaw quilt. The next quilt I wanted to share with you is a strip quilt. Now, I've made several of these, and I'm going to show you a couple of variations. You can make just a simple scrap quilt using just a very simple layout with sashing strips and cornerstones. So this is actually one of my go-to quilt patterns for scraps, or to use up a jelly roll that I only have one of. I also used this strip piecing technique for a pumpkin table runner. I have a video on that, and I'll put that in the link below. But these make fast, easy, fun quilts, and the outcome is outstanding. Now I want to show you another variation of this quilt. Now this was my own design. This is my own pattern, and I show you how to make this quilt in a video, and I'll put a link for that in the description below. I also use the 12-inch foundation papers for this quilt. Now this quilt looks a lot different than the quilt I just showed you, but the difference is the placement of the blocks and the little star cornerstones. But this pattern, this simple strip piece pattern, the simple strip pieced block can make fantastic quilts as you've just seen. Now the first one looked rather simple, but this one looks kind of complex, but it really isn't. Now this quilt is a Jelly Roll tube quilt, and I used leftover Jelly Roll strips for this quilt. I did have to pull some out of my stash and out of my scrap bins, but it looks kind of coordinated, but this makes a great scrap quilt. And I can see myself making more of these because this was fun and easy and it went together so quickly. Now you don't have to have a Jelly Roll. You can get in your scrap bins and make your own Jelly Roll strips. Now this was my latest scrap quilt, but I think perhaps it was the funnest one I've done. If you watch my Wednesday video, then you know that the quilt behind me is a quilt I'm working on with one of my sisters, and it's called Paa Box, and the pattern's from Saginaw Quilts. Now you could do this as a scrap quilt. We picked out the fabrics and coordinated them all together, but this quilt has inspired this block for me. And I'm going to get into my scraps and my fabric stash, hopefully, in 2024 and make a scrap quilt like this. This is the pattern I want to try for a scrap quilt in 2024. Now, I don't know if that's going to work. You know how our best laid plans are. Now, to make this quilt and this block, I used the Circle Savvy ruler by Creative Grids. I really did like using this ruler. In the description below, I'll put a link to this ruler as well as the Log Cabin Trim Tool 2 ruler that I used to make the first quilt. Now, I'm not a big fan of buying specialty rulers. I don't like having lots of rulers, but I really don't mind purchasing one if I can see multiple uses for it, which I can in this one. For this quilt, I did make a large courthouse step quilt as well as the log cabin quilt I showed you earlier. So I'll put a link to both of those rulers in the description below. Now, in the comments below, don't forget to tell me your favorite scrap quilt patterns. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and share with a friend. And as always, leave the comments. I love to get those comments, and I do try to reply to each and every one. So until next time, have fun quilting.